All right, welcome to the Bradford seminar series. Thank you for coming out in the cold and the rain. Delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Isabel Baptista. Let me start off with the kind of more formal, traditional introduction. Anna is Associate Professor of Environmental Policy and Sustainability at the New School. She is also Director of the Tishman Center for Environment and Design. She did undergraduate work at Dartmouth, master's work at Brown, PhD work at Rutgers, and I should add real life work in the environmental justice movement. Still part of the informal introduction. Part of formal introduction, going back to the Tishman Center, it is one of the, perhaps arguably, the leading environmental justice centers in the country today. And what I would call a real environmental justice center, in that she works not only in academia, but really is aimed at supporting the environmental justice grassroots movement. And so that's the formal introduction. Let me give you the environmental justice introduction, which is more important than the formal introduction. I was one of the leaders and most prominent people in the grassroots environmental justice movement, not only in New Jersey, but around the country. More important than that is she has respect of the EJ movement. So we do a lot and for full transparency, Anna and I have worked together for years. We're in a lot of meetings together, interacting on almost a daily basis. And I can tell you that if she's not in the meeting sometimes, whatever we're meeting about, sometimes a strategy for campaign we're doing, sometimes it's, more academic stuff, writing the papers, or whatever it's doing. One of the questions, if she's not there, from all the folks in the meeting, or some of the folks in the meeting, will invariably be, well, what does Anna think? And that's the kind of respect she has. And two things go into that. One thing she will not say, but she's really smart. So on any topic, you just want to get her, you want to get her insight. Abby Dillon, who's the head of Earth Justice, and I don't know if I told Anna this about Maya, but she referred, we were in one meeting, Anna was not there, and she referred to the brilliant Anna Baptista. That tells you, the amount of respect people have just for her innate abilities. And, and I don't like talking about people's intelligence, because that's been used against Black people for so long. Right? I don't like talking about it. I don't want to reinforce all the stuff about intelligence. But with Anna, it just jumps out. So I got to say it. But the other thing is, she has, and it's hard to explain this, but she has an EJ soul. Right? She kind of embodies what the EJ movement is. So when you talk to her, you're getting the EJ opinion. And that shouldn't be surprising. He says she was marching, you'll have to give them the age on her, but she was marching against the incinerator in Newark, when she was a kid. And she comes from an environmental justice neighborhood. So that shouldn't be surprising, but it's also because she has embraced the EJ movement and has worked in it all her life. So we go to, as I said, we go to a lot of meetings and we have different people as our team. But early on, I don't know if you remember this, Anna, years ago, I was doing the same thing. I was introducing Anna, and she was getting an award that night. And I said, when we go into a meeting, with whomever it is, whether it's with, government meeting, whether it's with green groups, whoever it is, I always feel like when we have Anna with us, it's our A team. That's our starting lineup. So today, I want you to know you're getting the environmental justice A team. Please come up. And I'm going to probably thank her for
Aw.
being here, especially
Gonna make me
cold day.
It's like too early for this. That's the sweetest introduction, right? You could tell Nikki and I spend a lot of quality time working together and wonderful colleagues and friends. And I'm very humbled by that introduction, Nikki, because Nikki is actually one of the foremost champions for EJ in the country. So, and I was a little baby grad student at Rutgers, living at home back with my family in Newark, trying to study environmental justice. And I came across Nikki's path as the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance was just forming, coming out of the second People of Color Summit. So this is a lesson to all of you students out there that showing up is half the battle, right? Showing up for the things you care about and sticking with it. And I've been able to be mentored and be part of a larger community because of that work of just showing up. So yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I do at the Tishman Center and some of the research that we're doing now on cumulative impacts. And true to form, Nikki's right. A lot of this work comes out of my own entanglements with environmental justice work that I'm doing as part of a broader coalition of folks on the ground here in New Jersey. So New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, Nikki and I are trustees there and have been with that organization since its inception, at least Nikki has, and the Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark, which is where I grew up and still very much a part of today. So first, a little bit about the Tishman Center for those of you who have not heard of it. We've been around for 20 years. We were an endowed center to focus on interdisciplinary work on environmental studies at the cross-section of design and policy. But in the last 10 years, we've tried to really refocus the center's mission around aligning with support and accompaniment for environmental and climate justice movement partners. So a lot of our work has turned towards movement and being good collaborative partners, co-developing research together with those partners, and using all of our tools in our toolbox, whether it's design or policy or advocacy, to work alongside those folks in support of frontline solutions. And in addition to doing movement support, we have a national fellowship. We support executive directors of environmental and climate justice organizations around the country to sort of innovate disruptive solutions for climate and environmental justice. We have a community of practice that I'll say a little bit more about that we're building with like-minded centers, research centers across the country to try to call in our peers and do more of this work that Nikki and I just do informally, but to do it a little bit in a more structured way. And as I mentioned, we do a lot of collaborative research and policy work on the ground with folks who call us in. And we do a lot of convening. So check us out, tishmancenter.org. We have really large platform of events during Climate Week in New York City, and then also during Earth Month. And I was asked to share a little bit about the community of practice work we're doing right now with centers across the country. This work came out of a sort of calling into our peer centers at a time back in 2023, 2024. There was a lot of federal funding for environmental and climate justice because of the Biden administration's commitment to Justice 40. And all of a sudden, there was this sort of record amount of funding, billions of dollars going towards environmental justice and climate justice. And there were, not surprisingly, a whole lot of universities who became very interested in environmental justice overnight. I thought it was partly our responsibility to call in those higher ed centers and say, there are best practices and ways to do this work that have to be respected and honored, and we have to be held accountable for. So we had a symposium back in 2024 to call our partners in to be in right relationship around that federal funding. And then, of course, we know what happened going after that in 2025. We had a very different situation. We called the symposium together again in Arizona with our partners, the Indigenous Resilience Center out of University of Arizona. And we did that with tribal communities in the Southwest to have a reset around, we went from billions of dollars to being targeted, to being on lists where you're banned from even saying the words environmental and climate justice. And so we had another moment to come together and recalibrate how we were going to continue to support our movement partners without the money, without the billions, right? And that's when you really see who's about that life, right? When the money disappears. And some of these centers here are the centers, there's 8 centers that we're forming a consortium around, the sort of community of practice around. And most of these centers have been around a long time, and they're people who are trusted by movement partners and who have committed to not only supporting each other in these difficult times, but supporting our movement partners. And Nikki's is an honorary member here, but I bring it up because maybe who knows, the center here at Princeton might want to be part of that larger convening of groups that we already have. And we published an article, it's an open access article about the symposium and its goals, so you can learn more about it there. We're having our next meeting in California with the University of Southern California, Manuel Pastor Center, the Equity Research Institute there in Occidental College. So maybe you'll join us out in March. And this is just a little thing from our first symposium. You get a bunch of academics and movement people together and they're like, we need a manifesto. I'm like, okay. So we have this manifesto. Several folks signed on to it. You can still sign on to it and check it out. You can click on the link there and see some of the sort of a snapshot of the sentiments and the commitments that were made at that first symposium that we've carried over and built upon. And we have a series of resources as well on the website about that manifesto if you're interested in learning more about it. But here, you're going to share what you all really came to hear more about, which is the cumulative impacts research that we've been doing at the center. And again, this work comes out of a calling in by partners. I was working very closely with our friends at the New Jersey EJ Alliance, the Ironbound Community Corporation, Clean Water, Earth Justice, a big coalition of us who had been pushing for a decade or more for a cumulative impacts approach to permitting in the state of New Jersey, and hitting a lot of brick walls. And finally, we had this opening to be able to push through a policy with a state legislator. And in that moment, the Tishman Center, wasn't just Isabel Baptista and Nikki Sheets. We were able to call in the resources of my center to sort of support our negotiations at those tables. And that sort of begot this whole database idea, because there were so many groups out there in the trenches trying to negotiate policies and sometimes not having access to resources about, what's already been written, what's been done, what could we pull out in terms of model language. And that was sort of the impetus for some of this early work. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term of cumulative impacts, it's, relatively new, I guess, in the EJ context, but it's been around a long time in traditional risk assessment and environmental laws like NEPA. And you see it a lot in ecological and epidemiological assessments. But cumulative impacts in the context of environmental justice has been a bit of an obstacle for EJ advocates because of the complexity of looking at chemical and non-chemical stressors, how they interact with extrinsic and intrinsic vulnerabilities in EJ communities. And oftentimes, many of the government agencies really assert that they don't have either the legal authority or the scientific capacity to understand those complexities and to act on cumulative impacts. On the other hand, communities who are suffering on the front lines of multiple burdens really see this as like we're living in a synergistic toxic soup, and we can't wait till the science is perfect. We need a response and we need action. And so the concept of cumulative impacts assessment, not as a risk assessment, but as an indicator of action, of policy action, became a big push by communities. They wanted scientists and agencies to turn away from traditional risk assessments and to lean into an indicator-based approach to cumulative impacts policymaking. And some of the work on cumulative impacts sort of follows the trajectory of the rise and fall of EJ policies at the state and national level as well. We see that, for, the inception of the EJ movement in the US in the 80s and 90s, there was a long period of time in which government agencies basically rejected outright the notion that there was such a thing as environmental inequity or environmental racism. But there was luckily a lot of scholarly evidence that emerged during that time to show particularly the distributive patterns of disparate and disproportionate impact in communities of color and low wealth communities, indigenous communities throughout the US. So once that was well established, established, I think in the literature, you start to see formal state and federal responses to EJ, although albeit largely symbolic. So we get the first executive order signed by Bill Clinton in 1994. Again, a pretty symbolic executive order. There wasn't very much in the way of like, we're going to stop these polluting industries, but more of an acknowledgement that there is a problem. And then in the early 2000s, you start to see reports coming out of bodies like the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, specifically around cumulative impacts. Why? Because communities in sacrifice zones kept hitting a wall against traditional permitting, traditional regulatory approaches, media by media, chemical by chemical, were not well suited to address many of the claims and demands of EJ communities who were facing these industries. So the EPA produces several reports throughout the 2000s on how you study cumulative impacts. They start to develop the EJ screening tool that gets released relatively late. I think out in 2016, they released EJ screening, although they had it for a long time. And then in 2023, we get Biden signing a new executive order on environmental justice that explicitly calls out cumulative impacts and the need to address cumulative impacts in permitting specifically, but in other ways as well. At the same time, where you have these largely symbolic procedural bills at the national level, states are innovating. You know, many states that are sort of ripe for environmental policymaking, generally blue states, are developing approaches in response to a lot of EJ movement activism and pushing from the ground up. You see California, for example, early in the 2000s developing the prototype, what would become CalEnviroScreen. And that really comes out of a push by academics and local groups developing that tool. And in 2007, there's about 40 states that have some mention of environmental justice and cumulative impacts. And today, all 50 states, even the very, very red states, have some mention of environmental equity or environmental justice in policies of some kind. So the institutionalization of the term starts to grow, but we still have this problem of, well, what are we actually doing about cumulative impacts, right? What is actually happening? Is it all symbolic? Is it all a lot of studying and hand-wringing and advisory committees, which is certainly what was happening at the federal level? Our work at the Tishman Center, as I mentioned before, comes out of this sort of direct engagement that I was having with the coalition in New Jersey, but also that I was having with EJ groups in places like Chicago and California and other places that were struggling, sort of battling it out, hand-to-hand combat with their city, with their municipal and their state legislators about pushing permitting and regulatory reform bills. And so we partnered with the University of Vermont, Law Clinic, and a few other law schools to start revamping this environmental justice state-by-state database, which is going to be going into its version 2.0 now in 2026. And we started doing some definitional work also on how policies define environmental justice communities. So that was some of our early work, and that helped feed into the New Jersey policy-making negotiations that we were having with the state of New Jersey during rulemaking. And for those of you who don't know, you should be very proud. You're sitting in the only state in the country that not only has an environmental justice law that specifically has a mandate to address cumulative impacts, a very strong mandate, but it also has rules, regulatory rules that implement that law. And that took, over 3 years to do and several decades to get there. And that's a huge groundbreaking thing. I think Nikki called it the holy grail of EJ, was being able to have a law that simply says no to permits, which doesn't seem that revolutionary, sort of just the very first step, but a very important step, because prior to that, there had never been, and there still isn't really, rules codified to say no to permits. And that early work in New Jersey was led by community organizations that led those negotiations with legislators. And the Tishman Center helped provide some technical support. For example, when we were arguing with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection about what are the ways we should define the communities that would be protected by this law. We call them environmental justice communities. In the law, they were codified as overburdened communities, OBCs, which is a little bit of a misnomer. And of course, we wanted to define those communities quite broadly based on race and income, because we wanted to afford at least the promise of protection for those communities, even if they didn't currently have pollution that they could potentially be targeted later. And the state had an interest in narrowing that definition, right? So their earliest definitions, for example, said that you had to not only be, a high percentage people of color census block group, but you also had to be at the same time a community with high population of low wealth, households with lower income. And it was sort of a very narrowing approach. So we had this fight, and the Tishman Center produced maps that showed the different cut points and what that would look like, what percentage of the state would get covered or not covered, and the cases. And again, I'm going to say this again and again, these are normative debates. These are a lot. You can cut this pie a million different ways. There's no magic science to this. These are deeply, deeply moral questions about what's fair, what's just. Where do you set those cut points? And there are different implications for different thresholds. And so we tried to make that case using some of the evidence that, the Tishman Center helped develop. And we created a database of some of the EJ policies that have been enacted and proposed in states. There's an article that will be coming out at the end of the month in the EJ Journal about the database, along with an article that Nikki is the lead author on, that I also helped co-author along with EJ Coalition folks, all in a special issue of the EJ Journal on cumulative impacts and permitting. So that'll be out in December, I think, as open access articles as well. But we created this database as a sort of really as a resource tool for advocates and lawmakers to be able to, look up and see what is sort of happening on the ground in real time. And you can check out, we've come a long way since we really started with a spreadsheet. We're like, here's our spreadsheet. Here's everything that you need to know, all the model, all the language out of these bills. We included both enacted and proposed bills. And now the list wasn't exhaustive, because particularly on proposed bills, we only looked for bills that had some innovative policy or, language that was coming out of committees. So it's fairly well formed, but it's hard to include all the proposed bills in all 50 states. So that part is not exhaustive. But it included the purpose of the bills, direct links so the advocates could download the entire legislative language of the bills. And we looked at different definitional characteristics, the methodologies, if there were any, thresholds, things that basically, if you were trying to debate a bill with a legislator, these are things you need to know. And now we have a 2.0 version that puts it in a map form, so you can just click on it. You have drop-down menus. And again, it's not meant to be comprehensive, although we have captured all of the states with enacted bills, so that have been codified. But proposed bills, we don't have 100% coverage on everything that's ever been proposed. And we narrowed it specifically to bills that have to do with cumulative impacts in permitting. So there are, in the first version of this database, we included everything in the kitchen sink that had to do with cumulative impacts, but a great majority of those proposed bills around cumulative impacts were about developing screening tools or advisory councils, for example, or maybe even public participation processes. We wanted to really hone in on bills that had language directed at regulations and permitting in particular, because those are the bills that can actually say no to industries. And so that's what we tried to focus in on. And you could see a little bit more about, I won't get into like how you use but the database, but I think it's pretty easy to navigate. And there's about 20 bills and policies in there that you can check out, and that are hyperlinked, so you can take a closer look at them if you want to compare. And you can still download the good old-fashioned spreadsheet. I like a good spreadsheet myself, so if you want that. And what do we see across these different policies? One of the more obvious things is that you see that after 2020, when New Jersey passes their groundbreaking law, you have this like explosion of model bills that start to get proposed in states, particularly in the last 2-3 years. Some of those bills are literally like copy and paste the New Jersey bill, like even the thresholds for, you know, the population characteristics that were pegged to our state averages. Like some states just adopted it wholeheartedly. So, and we see a big uptick in the proposed bills as well, even in the last year. So this is a very rapidly changing field with lots of policymaking newly getting proposed. And we have about 8 states that have actually have a codified bill in place, and then another 14 or so that have been proposed. And actually there's probably 2 more since then that have come online that we know of. We just got several of these states, 14 of these state advocates together during Climate Week for an in-person meeting. So we got all sorts of new updates on what's happening. So some of the things that we found in the sort of across these bills is that they follow a bit of a pattern. In this, we broke it down into this 3-part structure. The first is that many of these bills do the obvious thing, which is identify communities where the cumulative impacts permitting requirement will apply. And the terminology for defining these communities can vary. EJ communities, areas of concern, disadvantaged community, they sort of adopt different terms. And in New Jersey, for example, we termed it overburdened communities. In New York, it's disadvantaged areas. The second part that's common in these policies is that there's a requirement for a cumulative impacts analysis of some kind to be conducted that apply to a subset of facilities or permit types that are in close proximity to these or in these EJ communities, either by the census tract or census block group. And the facility types, permit types that are included tend to be first and foremost new permits, but industries also need renewals, and sometimes they need modifications and expansions. So all 3 of those types can be and often are mentioned all in these policies. And the methodology for how you do the cumulative impacts analysis is almost always punted to rulemaking. So it does not get codified in the law, right? So very important, rulemaking is very important. It's one thing to have the law in the books, but if you don't have the rules to implement them, very difficult to implement. And then the third part or element of these policies is that there's usually a course of action that pertains to the permit when it's triggered that is dependent on that analysis. So everything hinges on that analysis, or a lot hinges on that. And these mandates vary, but the essence is that the assessment, the cumulative impacts assessment or analysis, answers the question of whether the course of action is triggered, such as when does the permit under what conditions does the permit get denied or conditioned? It's a very, very important question. And is the mandate strong? It says you must deny it, you shall deny it, or is it leave the door open, may, for a lot of discretion to the agency? So very, very important. And of course, the bills usually involve some procedural content as well around public testimony and hearings. So a little bit about some important elements of the policies. The policies cover lots of different types of permits, and above all, they should cover new facilities, and then many also cover renewals and expansions. But the renewals are really important. A lot of communities focus almost exclusively on the new permits, like saying no to new things. But the renewals are immensely important because most of the facilities that are harming communities and creating that disparate impact are grandfathered in. They're already there. They're already overburdened. And the only way you can get at those facilities is either shutting them down, which takes a long time, a lot of organizing, or through the renewal process, they have to come in every few years to get a renewal of their permit. And that is a hook, a regulatory hook to start to ratchet down pollution in those facilities. And that's what these renewal conditions can do if they're crafted correctly. So it's the only real tool to sort of bring down that grandfathered disparate pollution burden, is through the renewal process. Very important. And the universe of facilities that are covered can vary greatly, but almost all the policies we have in our database cover major sources of air pollution. And you would imagine that's a huge concern for EJ communities, but also a lot of waste facilities, power plants, generators of different kinds. And some, you see a lot of local tailoring of facilities based on states. Like some states in North Carolina, their bill focuses heavily on CAFOs, right? Like these large agricultural operations that are a big concern for EJ communities. California has a bill specific to hazardous waste sites. So it can vary based on the local context. And then the relevant scope of how they define EJ communities is also important. Like how broadly do they define that, how narrowly? A little bit more on that. I mean, we can spend a lot of time, and some of my research staff have, looking at some of the factors for how states define EJ communities in their bills. And you'll see that the most common indicators are sociodemographic indicators. So race, income, limited English proficiency, and then in some cases, identification with a tribal community, indigenous communities. Many of the definitions use a disjunctive approach. So you just have to meet one of those sociodemographic indicators to meet the qualification of the definition, but not universally. Like, I think some states like Michigan here, you have to have more than one. So you have to have the income and one other, right? So they can vary. And in New Jersey, actually, they had a conjunctive approach. They said you had to have all three. You had to have limited English proficiency, low income, and race to qualify. And we, got them away from that, right? We got them to a disjunctive approach. Obviously, a disjunctive approach covers a lot more territory, a lot more of your population, and especially in a very diverse state like New Jersey. So the proportion of the population covered in a state can vary greatly dependent on this EJ definition that are codified in the laws. In some states, for example, they also allow self-identification, like groups can petition the state to be considered an EJ community. Other parts of the CI policies have to do with the mandate. I mentioned the shall versus may in the denial of new permits. This is a huge thing. It's one word that, Nikki can attest to how heavily debated it was. We had to bring in our legislators to back us up in the negotiating tables with the state of New Jersey, because this was a huge thing to say that the state says we must deny the permit when the conditions are met under the CI analysis. And it was honestly, if you left it at may, that one word difference, you basically leave the door open for the existing discretion that we always believe the states had already. In permitting, we always made the case that we believe states had the authority, the legal authority to say no to permits. And they always said we didn't. So having that must deny mandate was really important. So many of the bills have similar statutory language. For example, in New York State, they adopted a similar must deny approach, but they only did so for new permits. So in New Jersey, like in New York, the standard is different for renewals. So for renewals, there's no must deny. You can only condition the permit. So if they meet that threshold of cumulative impacts, they can condition it, but they can't deny it. And the other part of the policy that's important to note is what is the statutory language of, how much is too much, right? What's the analysis that says at this threshold, it's a cumulative burden? The language in the law doesn't tell you the methodology for the analysis, but it tells you the language that has to apply to that standard. So how much is too much additional pollution? In New Jersey, the language in the law is that the amount is if an industry or if an applicant causes or contributes any amount of additional burden, right? So that's a low bar. It's great, right? One drop rule, we call it, right? So there's no having to prove disparate or disproportionate, significantly more. It's any contribution that causes or contributes. In Minnesota, their law, the language is that the contribution has to be mean a substantially adverse impact. So you have to then define in rulemaking what is substantial. What does that look like? In New York, there's two slightly different approaches to the standard. New permits are denied if contributing more than a de minimis amount. And right now in rulemaking in New York State, they're fighting over what de minimis means. Okay, and there's a lot of lawyers fighting over that right now. But where modifications and renewals are denied only if they're contributing a significant increase. So de minimis versus significant. Again, all of this then has to get worked out in rulemaking. So important stuff, a little bit boring. I know I took you down a little bit of a path, but these are important. Like these are like the nitty gritty details that mean the world of difference of whether you can actually implement the law you set out to do. The other thing we wanted to point out in the policies is that many of the policies have provisions that are related to compelling public interest clauses or community benefits agreements. And from the environmental justice advocate perspective, these are hugely dangerous loopholes, potentials. These are pitfalls along the way. Because anytime you have an exemption clause, it opens the door, obviously, to basically blow up the whole bill, right? And if you make that compelling public interest or the CBA the exit strategy for an industry to get out of getting a denial, it's tremendously dangerous for an EJ community. So in New Jersey, Michigan, Georgia, all these states, we do have a public exemption clause, but advocates in New Jersey worked really hard to narrow that exemption clause so that it does not include, for example, economic returns. So it cannot be about economics, tax rate, tax ratables, jobs. It has to be very, very specifically tailored to environmental benefit to the community that's hosting it in the CBA, the census block. But not all laws tighten it that way. The compelling public interest provision in Minnesota, for example, is a CBA. A permit that would be under normal circumstances denied can enter into a CBA negotiation with the state. Okay, so now it leaves the fate in the hands of the state. Similarly, in Connecticut, there's a CBA, and the CBA is negotiated directly with the municipality. So it's a way to really, unfortunately, undermine the intent of the bill. So I think we covered part 1 and 3, and I just wanted to say a little bit more about the CI analysis. We actually don't have a lot of examples to look at in terms of CI analysis and methodologies because very few states have gone through the rulemaking. New Jersey is the only one that has gone to completion. New York is currently in the middle of it. Massachusetts is currently in the middle of rulemaking. Vermont is currently in the middle of rulemaking, and Minnesota is finishing. So we have a lot of states that are still battling it out in rulemaking. And so we don't have a lot of great examples with a few exceptions. So I wanted to mention that, at least 2 methodologies that we know are on the table. One is what we call the California method or the single score method. And this is part of the Cal Enviro screen. This method was one that Minnesota adopted, for example. So they're using that method there. It, basically combines environmental and social indicators into one index score, right? And then sets a threshold that designates an area that's experiencing or not experiencing CI based on that. And the New Jersey method, which some people call the matrix method, takes a different approach. It looks at social and environmental stressors individually and then compares each stressor to the geographic point of comparison. So, a lot of people ask us, well, which one is better? Which one works better? We actually don't know yet, right? The New Jersey method was developed with the idea that it was a simpler method. It's actually a very complex method, but it's simpler to defend legally. That's, what they believe. The California method hasn't really been tested as a permitting denial tool. It's been used so far for enforcement purposes and for allocating the California greenhouse gas emissions funding. So they haven't actually used it to say no to permits yet, but it could be used for that. And I'll just say one more thing. There's a lot, obviously, in policies around public participation. We haven't looked in depth at the public participation provisions of these bills. Mostly, it's something that I think requires additional attention in terms of how determinative are these public processes. From what we can see in New Jersey, this can be, some of these can be very superficial, right? Sort of business as usual public participation processes. So an area of future research for sure for folks to consider. And then, just takeaways here is that there's some key decision points. It's important to get into rulemaking, the details, and just having a mapping tool. Lots of states have mapping tools. Cities and states, tons of them have now some version of an EJ screening tool. That doesn't lead necessarily to strong policies. And that's, in fact, what we found is that if we waited around for everybody to have great tools, and that's all it took to get good policies, we'd be in much better shape today. It was when New Jersey folks said, we didn't have a tool, and we weren't going to wait for a tool. We wanted the policy. And then with the policy, we developed the tool. And that has unlocked a lot of action on policy making. So just having tools doesn't really lead you to necessarily to policy enactment, although they can be very helpful, of course. And most importantly, key takeaway is that EJ groups have to be on the front lines of negotiating sort of what are the most important elements of EJ laws. They know the best what are the biggest burdens. They know the best where those normative thresholds of fairness around how to define EJ communities and how to ground truth that, what are the facilities of greatest concern, and what is a fair threshold to say, or standard by which you say, this is too much. Those are all normative questions that EJ communities should be in the driver's seat around. Unfortunately, we see a lot of times technical advisors and even our friends in academia getting very involved in policymaking without accountability to grassroots communities on the ground that are going to have to live with the policies. And if you pass a weak EJ bill, those communities will have to live with the fact that there's a bill on the books that does nothing for them to alleviate their conditions. And the opportunity cost of that is tremendous for the communities that have to live with those burdens. So it's a huge lesson to take the lead from those communities on the ground, who ultimately have to deal with and account for what happens or doesn't happen. And I hopefully haven't taken you down too many rabbit holes of cumulative impacts. You know more than you probably ever wanted to know about cumulative impacts. But feel free to follow us at the Tishman Center and check out more of this work. We do update the database every 6 months, so we try to stay on top of what's happening in that field and update it as we go every January and August. All right, so I think I'm at time to take questions. Yeah, and tell me your name, please.
Hi, Lexi. I'm Vivek. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think I was really curious about, for example, when you're talking about discretion for projects, I'm really curious what will happen with these smaller infrastructure projects that at the state level, but are approved by smaller regional or local authorities. And so I guess I'm just really curious as to how does the interpretation of these really complex state laws at the local level impact the approval of these smaller projects, and what's the role of that interaction?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are developments and infrastructure investments that don't necessarily need environmental permits, and not all permits are covered by these laws. So in New Jersey, for example, a lot of public works projects aren't covered by this law. New Jersey doesn't have a mini NEPA, so we actually don't trigger a mini NEPA review for some of these infrastructure projects. So, but in places like Massachusetts, they are grappling with they have a mini NEPA, how do they attach this new requirement to things that are getting state funding or federal funding for infrastructure, and like what's in and what's out. And that's getting negotiated state by state in terms of what's the facilities or permits covered by these rules. So it's I think going to be a state by state answer depending on where that shows up. I would say largely the bills that have been enacted focus more heavily on like Title V permits, which are major air permits, and waste permits, a lot of hazardous waste and large scale waste infrastructures, not so much on the sort of public water, public works projects. Although if you have a mini NEPA in your state, it could implicate that mini NEPA. New York is also has a mini NEPA, also is grappling. They have 2 separate rulemaking processes attached to their CEQA. With this EJ law. So those things have to get worked out. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I did a class on Dutch musicians and the special students are here. Awesome. But this seems really relevant to what we've been discussing in class. So thank you for your education. I also work on a lot of mining issues. And I was wondering, there was a mention of how Indigenous people are considered in the criteria. I think in the Michigan example that you had of it, I was wondering how that looks across the different examples in different states. And then if you have, I guess there's not a lot of examples yet, but sort of predictions about how this might play out in like urban versus rural settings. They're create for certain expectations around population density or anything like that.
Yeah. So the question is around how these types of cumulative impacts bills look for Indigenous communities across the country, and then in urban versus rural settings where you have different implications potentially around what gets covered. We haven't seen too much of what it could look like. I think one of the aspects of defining an EJ community has to be to look at your state demographics and communities of concern historically, not just in the sense of the numbers. So in places like New Mexico, for example, that have a proposed bill, places where tribal communities are very strong, even in New Jersey's law, I didn't put it up there, also has a provision for Indigenous communities that are state or federally recognized are also included. So that doesn't show up in that socio-demographic threshold. They don't have to meet the demographic thresholds. They can just be an Indigenous community. But I think that question is very important because if you set a threshold and it's being driven by state averages and you have you have very urban and very rural communities, that might not be enough to capture it, which is why some states are asking for self-identification and petitioning to happen so that you can capture those smaller, in some cases, unincorporated areas of the state that wouldn't otherwise get captured with those thresholds. So it is an important consideration to make when you're defining the communities that you want to extend protection to through the bill. And I know in a lot of states that's been a big part of the debate because generally state agencies want to narrow the focus. And if they could, they would literally just take a marker and be like, just these 3 areas. That's it. And one of the things that we debated a lot in New Jersey was well, it's not just the communities that are harmed today that we know about today. It's communities that, because of the nature of, this country and the history of discrimination and what's happened with Indigenous communities, they may become targeted later. So they may not have the presence of burdens today, but they could. And so they should at least be considered up front in the definition on the historical basis of potential harm, which, these days is controversial to say, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, great talk. I'm really excited to see that database get published. I was wondering if you could speak more on given what you said about how rulemaking is difficult and a lot of these thresholds are normative and highly negotiated, what is being done at the state level to make sure that rulemaking is adaptive to lessons learned as we start to implement with these rules, and how I guess EJ communities can be centered in that adaptive rulemaking?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, how can communities be centered in rulemaking and have a more adaptive or iterative rulemaking process? It's a great question and it's a great problem because honestly, rulemaking in environmental, regulatory, it is very technical, very complicated, and often very opaque. Many communities are not privy to the work that the agency takes internally to develop the prototypes for the rules and the initial language for the rules. We had a very unique situation in New Jersey where we were let into that process in an informal basis at the invitation of the state. Similar to what happens with industries. When they're doing rulemaking, for example, for an entire sector of an industry, they'll invite that industry in to have early conversations around what's being thought about and prototyped. Communities rarely get brought in that phase of the process and in a very open and iterative way. They get usually brought in once it's pretty well baked inside an agency. So cracking that rulemaking process open and getting access to it, I guess if we had to go back and do it over again, our advice we're giving people now is make sure that you establish a foothold in the rulemaking process, either through informal channels or through some formal way, that you can gain access to the people who are writing the draft rules. And these are usually the legal folks, the legal counsel in the agencies. It's wildly important. If you don't get brought into that process to the very end, it's very hard to get the agency to move away from the thing that they've baked for 2 years. We're seeing that in New York State. New York State is right now in the middle of rulemaking, and they crack the window this much. They let you in to come tell them what you think about public participation processes. But we're like, hey, but how are you defining de minimis? We want to know that part. And being able to have enough leverage as a coalition of groups to be able to insert yourself in that process is important. Like, who do you have to pressure and organize around to be able to insert yourself in the rulemaking process in a much more assertive way? Not an easy thing. Nobody tells you how to do that. Most groups have not had that experience. So it's important though. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Colin. I'm a student in geosciences from West Virginia, which is part of why I asked this question. So like with DuPont and like Teflon in my state, there was no monitoring for PFAS and other sort of waste products. And then it was like a big whistleblower thing when it was realized. And so I guess my question is on compliance and how they're measuring that with this permitting. Say there's a new substance that's being introduced so that you don't know the risks of how is that incorporated into this? And do these regions of risk get like more testing to make sure that they're not being taken advantage of when nobody's looking? Like with more water testing, more quality control. So I guess I'm just kind of curious about making these laws like for permitting sounds really awesome, but then what if a company or a corporation is making a cool change on the side? Is there like extra monitoring or extra vigilance for these communities that don't have the resources to do that themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is there enforcement or monitoring enhancements built in to these new policies? Honestly, I haven't seen that particular aspect of bills being introduced, although there's no reason why you couldn't actually require in a new bill that there's enhanced monitoring. I don't think the New Jersey bill had enhanced monitoring or enforcement. It did have new rules around what you could require as conditions. And part of the conditions could be additional enforcement and monitoring, right? So if you're in for a renewal, now the state has discretion. They can say, well, based on your track record and your history of noncompliance, we want you to, instead of report in once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year. So they could put that into conditions for permits at their discretion, but they could also build it into the body of the law, right, where they do additional enforcement and monitoring. I haven't seen that, but that could be a new element that they could add. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah.
In terms of pollution that might affect communities that are downstream or part of the shared waterways or like airflow ways, like for example, along the Delaware watershed in New Jersey, excuse me, Pennsylvania, but it's affecting communities in New Jersey. Have they figured out a way to deal with kind of shared cross-boundary vectors of pollution in terms of identifying EJ communities, but then also in quantifying what to do about that and how you can actually protect some of these different communities from the cumulative impact upstream?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen any policy so far that propose any cross-boundary. There have been some bills that do the definition of EJ communities or burden communities with radii approaches. So it's like 3 miles or 5 miles around the proposed facility. And that can capture multiple census blocks. But I haven't seen that where you have like a bi-state, where it's now you're reaching into another state's jurisdiction. So that's an interesting issue or problem to consider when you're thinking about the potential harm, right? And for New Jersey, for example, we're grappling with that now in the implementation phase, where you have census block groups whose demographics have changed in the 1 year since the application came in, or where you're arguing over, okay, there's a zero population census block group because it's an industrial area, but the groups that are adjacent, and that's being legally contested right now by some of the industry groups in court. So those nuanced questions about where the area of impact is and where are the EJ communities is an important one to think about how do you build that into the design of the policy up front? Because sometimes it's hard to foresee that because you don't know the new applications that are going to come in, right? You kind of can guess the renewals, but you don't know the new ones. But yeah, interesting question. I don't have the answer, but yeah, I think this is the last question. Yeah. One more, sneak one in, and Nikki.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm Melissa. I was wondering about kind of the status now that rulemaking has been established in New Jersey, how it's been going with DEP. Do EJ communities still feel like they have some foot in the door? And from the website, DEP website, it looks like only one final decision has been made.
No, there's been 2 or 3 now,
Okay.
all on renewals. No new permit yet, although it's coming. So if all of you live in New Jersey right now, currently, maybe. So it's important, if you check out the New Jersey EJ Alliance's website, you'll see our comments on the first 3 permits that have been conditioned, and very disappointing, kind of lackluster, looks a lot like business as usual renewals. And they could have gone a lot further and didn't in the conditions. So we've sent out letters to the DEP. We've been talking to them actively about our disappointment about like the low bar. Part of this they claim is a learning curve for their permitters. They're used to doing things a certain way. But we're the New Jersey, the advocates have to be vigilant. You have to be like, okay, we're going to be on top of every permit now that you issue a decision out under this bill. There's going to be 2 permit hearings coming up in the next few weeks. If you go on the New Jersey EJ Alliance website, you'll see those 2 permits. You can join via Zoom or in person, and you can weigh in. You can help weigh in and push the DEP to go further. And so I encourage you to do that because we need like public input and pressure to pressure the agency to be accountable to those decision points. So, get involved, join up for the New Jersey EJ Alliance newsletter because we'll put out alerts to everyone to come out for those hearings. Yeah.
So thanks for good questions.
Thank you all.